Way back in 1750, a man was murdered along this unremarkable stretch of state highway running through southern Rhode Island. How do I know? Well, because there's a stone monument hidden in the bushes that tells the whole story, of course. There are no signs pointing towards this monument, no sidewalks on the highway that it watches over, and really no chance at all that you would ever stumble across this granite pillar by accident. The inscription on the stone is a little hard to see with all the underbrush swallowing it up, but if you get the right angle, then you can read the story that's stretched across the four sides of the pillar. According to the stone, a man named William Jackson once walked along this road with a ship captain named Thomas Carter, who, unfortunately, had just wrecked his boat along the New England coast. Jackson had been kind enough to lend the poor sailor some money and a horse to help him get home, but apparently that was not enough for Carter, who decided to rob and kill Jackson with a dagger right here in this spot where the pillar stands today. A few months later, Carter was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang in a gibbet along the side of the road, where the shrieking of the chains in the wind terrified anyone who happened to stroll by the dangling body of the killer. And by the way, if you don't know what a gibbet is, here's a picture for you. Seems pretty gruesome, right? And also seems like a perfect topic for a video. This is exactly the kind of thing that I like to cover on this channel. We have an interesting and strange historic tale, an old monument that's almost completely forgotten nowadays, and most importantly, a whole lot of questions to answer. Like, where did this monument come from? Who put it up? And why did they feel the need to include details about the shrieking of the chains scaring the neighborhood? Well, in this video, we are definitely going to answer all of those questions and more, because that's how these things work, right? You find a video topic, and then you do your research, and you find all the answers, and the completed video ends up exactly like how you first envisioned it when you started the project. So how about we get going on this nice, trim, tightly focused, maybe 8-minute long video that succinctly and thoroughly solves every mystery behind this monument. Just like I thought I was going to make when I first heard about this stone. So, of course, the first place to start here is with the murder story itself. Is the narrative inscribed on the stone even real? Did this actually happen as written? Well, the answer is kind of. Without a doubt, Thomas Carter was found guilty of killing William Jackson while the two were walking along that road, and likewise, Carter's body absolutely was publicly strung up in chains after he was executed. I found plenty of old newspaper articles from 1751 that confirm that information. But beyond those broad strokes, historians and folklorists really cannot agree on the details. I found a ton of different sources describing this story, and almost all of them harbor some pretty major disagreements with each other and with the stone. Like, for example, the monument says that Carter killed Jackson with a dagger, but this book from 1936 claims that he instead hit him over the head with a rock. The stone also says that the murder happened at midnight on New Year's Eve in 1750, but if you want to trust this particular book I found, then maybe it was actually 1741. And according to the monument, when the victim's body was found, it was identified as William Jackson because a local innkeeper recognized a button on Jackson's vest. But this Rhode Island history book from 1929 says that the innkeeper actually recognized Jackson from an off-color lock of hair on his head. And in fact, according to that book, Jackson and Carter actually stayed at the innkeeper's house the night before the murder, and while they were there, the innkeeper pointed out Jackson's hair and literally said, "Hey, if you ever get murdered, then I'll be able to identify your body because of that strange lock of hair." So clearly, this story has been heavily infiltrated by folklore and legend, to the point where some of the stuff that you'll read about this murder is just off the wall outlandish. Like, check this out. A lot of sources claim that Carter's body was left hanging in the gibbet on the side of the road for literally years, which, granted, definitely could have happened. That was not all that strange back when gibbets were in use. But then, on top of that, there's a version of the story where Carter's sister supposedly built a hut right next to the gibbet and lived there for years so that she could shoot at birds who were trying to eat her brother's body. And if that's not enough, some people even said that a local kid actually somehow got a hold of one of Carter's bones and then kept the bone under his desk at school so that he could use it to crack open walnuts. Even as far back as 1903, people were already saying stuff like, "So much fiction concerning this murder has been printed that no clear understanding can now be obtained." Clearly, this is not a story that's easy to feel confident about. For hundreds of years now, it's been a bit of a mystery. So maybe we better just move on, try and tackle this stone from a new direction. Because so far, we haven't really solved anything, and in fact, it kind of feels to me like all we've done is raise new questions about the monument. Now I'm wondering where the stone got its version of events from. Why include these specific details out of the dozens of competing narratives? Why mention the button on Jackson's vest, but not the lock of hair? And what was the reasoning behind saying that the murder weapon was a dagger instead of a rock? To answer these questions, we are probably going to have to look elsewhere. So how about we talk about the man who built the monument? Because believe it or not, this pillar was not constructed by a government agency or some kind of historical society. No, this monument was entirely the brainchild of a single private citizen, Joseph Peace Hazard. There's his name inscribed along the bottom of the stone, along with the year the pillar was erected, 1889. So now I feel like the next steps are pretty obvious. Let's include that name and year combination in our research and see if we can find anything that might shed some light on this monument. And wouldn't you know it, there's actually a ton of good stuff. I found plenty of newspaper and magazine articles talking about the erection of this monument. Some from when the stone was first put up, and some from a few decades later. We even got a blurry picture from 1932 showing how the monument used to look before it was swallowed up by all the bushes. Pretty cool, right? The problem with these articles, though, is that they're all pretty dry. For the most part, they just say, "Hey, Mr. Joseph Peace Hazard recently put up a monument commemorating the spot where William Jackson was murdered." And then they print the inscription on the stone, and that's really about it. There's no interviews with Joseph Hazard, and there's nothing about where he got his information, and nobody bothered to ask him why he wanted to put up this stone 138 years after the original murder. There's nothing like that at all. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of interesting stuff to chew on here. But you want to hear something that is interesting? While I was hunting for articles about the murder monument, I also found a lot of other articles about Joseph Hazard putting up other monuments all across southern Rhode Island. Apparently, this guy just loved to put up stones. Check this out. See this rather large and busy intersection here in South Kingstown, Rhode Island? Well, back in 1886, Joseph Peace Hazard put up a monument here declaring that this was now Dale Carlia Corners, because there used to be a homestead nearby called Dale Carlia Farm that Hazard wanted to honor. And if we head down to that same intersection today and we look in just the right spot, then we can see that his granite marker has stood the test of time, still standing tall in 2025. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. For another Hazard landmark, we can head over to this intersection in Wakefield, Rhode Island. About 4 miles south of here is the famous Point Judith Lighthouse. So, in 1887, Joseph Hazard put up a monument with a little engraved hand pointing in the direction of the lighthouse. And wouldn't you know it, that too is still there in 2025. Although, as you can see, it doesn't seem like very many people rely on this stone to help them find the lighthouse anymore. In addition to those roadside monuments, Hazard also constructed several stones in southern Rhode Island's historic cemeteries. For a great example, we can head back to South Kingstown, Rhode Island. Supposedly, behind this gate here is a small cemetery that houses the remains of Major William Lunt, an American officer from the Revolutionary War. Back in 1874, the Providence Bulletin printed an article about the history of South Kingstown that included some pretty interesting little anecdotes about William Lunt. Like, apparently, Lunt was a barber who once gave George Washington a shave during the Revolutionary War, and after the war, every year, Lunt always raised the finest pig in the whole town. And also, during the 1870s, Joseph Peace Hazard paid for a brand new stone to honor the grave of Major William Lunt. So how about we go and see if we can find that stone? And there it is, yet another of Joseph Hazard's contributions to Rhode Island's local history. But if you thought that stone was cool, just wait for this one. Here we are at another historic cemetery in South Kingstown. This one very snugly tucked in against the highway. At the back of the cemetery, right near the highway on-ramp, is a handsome gravestone commemorating 3 members of the Allan family, who died in the early 18th century. Now, at first, you might assume that this stone was put up by Joseph Hazard, right? But no, here's what actually happened. Back when those 3 people died in the 1700s, really nice, fancy stones were put up for them in the graveyard. But by about 1880, those fancy stones were in pretty poor shape. So Joseph Hazard came in and paid to have the stones restored and fixed up. And then, in 1917, the stones were in bad shape again, so Joseph Hazard's brother removed them from the cemetery and placed them in the porch of the nearby Peacedale Congregational Church for safekeeping. And then he put up this new stone to take their place. Now, here is where things get real interesting. If you go down to that church today and you walk up to the porch and you peer in the window, then you can still see the original gravestones restored by Joseph Hazard embedded in the wall of the porch over 100 years later. They're a little tough to see in the dark through the windows, but there they are. How awesome is that? But hey, just hold on a minute here. Like, as cool as all that is, I kind of feel like we're getting pretty far off track, aren't we? Like, this was supposed to be a video about that murder monument in the bushes. Clearly, we are not going to uncover the mysteries of that stone by peering into church windows. So, how about we take a big step back and we talk a whole lot more generally about Joseph Peace Hazard. Like, who even was this guy and what's his story? Maybe if we learn a little bit more about his life, that might help us to unravel the mysteries of his murder monument. Well, right off the bat, it is extremely obvious that Joseph Hazard was not an average Joe. Just his last name alone can tell you that. About a century ago, the Hazard family of Rhode Island was extremely famous and successful in this part of the country, with the main source of their wealth being a large manufacturing company in Peacedale, Rhode Island. And so, when Joseph Peace Hazard was born in 1807, he had a bit of a silver spoon in his mouth, a $3 million inheritance split between him and his two brothers. That is well over $100 million in today's money. Here, though, is where Joseph's life starts to drift away a little bit from the rest of his family. While Joseph's brother Tom became a well-known journalist and his brother Roland continued with the family's manufacturing business, Joseph himself never did a particle of work in his life, according to those who knew him. He didn't believe in working, apparently. Didn't even want to pretend to make money on his own. And so, instead, he traveled and he studied, and over time, he became rather well respected in Rhode Island for his intellect and worldly experience. And also, I should probably mention that Joseph Peace Hazard was an absolutely huge believer in spiritualism. This is where things really get crazy. See, if you don't know, spiritualism is a sort of catch-all term from the 1800s and early 1900s that covers all sorts of belief in the supernatural. In the 19th century, there was a huge explosion of people believing in everything from seances to hypnotisms to ghostly hauntings. And our friend Joseph Hazard was right in the middle of all of it. And if you're wondering how I know this, well, it's actually a pretty funny story. While I was doing research on Joseph Hazard, I learned that the library at Rhode Island College, the South Kingstown Public Library, and the Rhode Island Historical Society, all three have very sizable collections of letters and journals that were written by Joseph Peace Hazard. Between the three libraries, there are literally hundreds of pages of handwritten notes. To me, this seemed like a slam dunk, right? Like, obviously, there has got to be something in these pages about the murder monument. And so, I started looking through the collections from the various libraries, and pretty much right away, I found this: Joseph Hazard's diary. 200 pages covering years of his life. There has got to be something pertinent to the video in this, right? So, I popped open the journal, and real quick, I learned that this diary is actually a record of all the times that Joseph Hazard's watch mysteriously rang all by itself. See, one time in 1878, while Joseph Hazard was traveling in Syria, he went to place his watch under his pillow when the watch started making a weird ringing noise that he had never heard before. And then, from that point on, Joseph spent the next 13 years of his life keeping diligent record of every time that his watch rang on its own. the vast majority of pages in this journal look a whole lot like this. November 16th, 1878. Watch rang this morning, but only a little. November 30th. Watch rang under my pillow and musically. December 7th. Watch rang under my pillow nearly half an hour and nearly incessantly, nor did it cease until I changed my position. December 8th. Watch rang long time, at short intervals, and very sweetly. You get the idea, right? Like, I have read through this entire journal, and honestly, it is so strangely captivating that it almost deserves its own video. Like, of course, Joseph Hazard interpreted his watch ringing as spirits trying to communicate with him, and so the whole journal is just him slowly and diligently trying to piece together what the spirits could possibly be trying to say. And crucially, the watch only rang at night while Joseph was in bed, and it never once rang in the presence of another human being. So Mr. Hazard was totally on his own here, trying to decipher these spirit messages. At first, when the watch rang in Syria, he thought that the spirits were trying to tell him that he'd be in danger if he stayed in the country. So right away, he hopped on a boat and he left for Italy. But then later on, in addition to the ringing, the watch started occasionally playing music and making explosion sounds and generating loud rhythmic hammering noises. And so Joseph had to get to work trying to figure out what all that stuff meant too. He actually started writing down whatever he did throughout the day when the watch rang so that he could sort of connect the dots on if the sounds had anything to do with his actions. Like on April 18th of 1887, the watch rang much more quietly than usual, and Joseph thought that that might have been because he went for a very long walk that day. Or in September of that same year, the watch rang in a very low tone for over a half hour, and Joseph thought that that was probably because he tripped and fell into a ditch earlier that day. And then, on one day in November, the watch didn't ring at all, but instead ticked very loudly and abnormally. And Joseph thought that that might have happened because he had recently quit eating vegetables. The absolute best part of this journal, though, is that Joseph actually gets some closure by the end of his life, at least in his mind. See, in April of 1887, Hazard went to visit this spiritualist husband and wife, a couple of friends of his, that had a particular gift for connecting with the other side. And during that visit, the couple told Hazard that a few nights ago, they had been visited by the spirit of Hazard's mother, who had told them that she had been the one ringing Hazard's watch for all these years. And this really helped Hazard formulate a theory. By the end of the journal in 1890, Joseph Peace Hazard was absolutely convinced that his watch rang whenever the spirit of his mother wanted to warn him that he was in ill health. And there you go. Now, after all that, you might be thinking that the watch ringing journal here is the standout in these Hazard collections. And in a way, it is. It's definitely very interesting, and it's definitely the longest document in the collection. But at the same time, believe it or not, the actual content of the journal is kind of tame in comparison to some of Hazard's other experiences with spiritualism. Let me just take a moment here and walk you through a few of my favorite selections from the Joseph Peace Hazard collection. Because I've read a ton of these files now, and it is truly unlike anything that I've ever encountered before. So let me just give you like a top 10-ish favorite Joseph Peace Hazard spiritualist anecdotes. Here's a great one to start with. In January of 1858, Joseph Hazard was traveling in Constantinople when a very sad-looking sultan gazed at him from a passing carriage. Joseph and the sultan locked eyes in a most extraordinary manner, and even as the carriage began to pull away, the Sultan stuck his head out the window so he could continue to stare at Joseph until the carriage rode too far away to keep eye contact. According to Joseph, that Sultan was murdered not too long after the staring incident. And then, a few years later, back in Rhode Island, Joseph was conducting a seance with his brother Thomas when all of a sudden, the door of a nearby closet eked open and out walked the Sultan, or at least his spirit, materialized for a moment in human form and draped in a great golden robe. The Sultan sat down in a chair and beckoned for Joseph to come closer, and when Joseph came over, the Sultan took a pair of scissors, cut a square inch of golden cloth from his robe, and presented it to Joseph. And that is basically the end of the story. Joseph does not say what happened to the Sultan's ghost after that, so I guess he just went back in the closet. Next up, in 1859, Joseph wrote that a close friend of his died in Florence. And then, 2 days after the funeral, the friend's spirit came to visit Joseph in his hotel room and hammered on a table so loud it sounded like a carpenter driving nails with a mallet. In 1890, Joseph was traveling through France on a coach when he learned that the passenger sitting next to him was Irish. So naturally, Joseph asked the guy if he had heard of the Banshee from Ireland. No explanation, of course, on what Banshee he was talking about. In 1876, Joseph Hazard attended a spiritualist conference in Philadelphia. And during the conference, the ghost of George Washington materialized in front of the entire audience and even shook Joseph Hazard's hand. In 1870, Joseph wrote this little 2-page leaflet that explained how to conduct home seances. In the leaflet, Joseph very specifically warns against giving your money to professional mediums. He says that most families already have at least 1 or 2 members who are naturally attuned to the spirit world, so just save your money, don't invite strangers into your house, and instead follow this 8-step process for holding seances all on your own. I really like this one because I think it shows how sincere Joseph was about all this spiritualist stuff. There is no cynicism in his writing whatsoever. He is not trying to con anybody or rip anybody off. Next, this is one of my favorite things that Hazard ever wrote. In May of 1885, he went to go and visit his nephew and his wife. And when he got back from the visit, he wrote this in his journal. "My watch is apt to ring when I have spent the evening at my nephew John's house. Both himself and his wife are mediumistic. Highly so, I think." I know. In April of 1886, Joseph Hazard was walking down the street in New York City when his mind drifted back in time to a very kind woman whose house he once stayed at in London, a fond memory for him. The only problem, though, is that he couldn't remember the woman's name. He was thinking and thinking and thinking, and then all of a sudden, a cart rolled past him on the street with the name Skelton painted on the side. And wouldn't you know it, that was the name of the woman that he was trying to remember. Of course, Mrs. Skelton's spirit must have sent the cart to help Joseph remember her. One time, Joseph slipped and fell on some ice, and he would have died if not for the spirits. And last but not least, this is my very favorite one. One time, Joseph Peace Hazard scored 11 points on one billiard shot because some spirits came down and guided his cue. He made absolutely sure to tell every billiard player he ever met about that one. Like, I just love this guy. This is one of my favorite characters that I've ever talked about in a video. But, okay, As fun as all that is, just telling random spiritualist stories is not going to get us any closer to answering questions about the murder monument. So I don't know about you, but I'm feeling like we better just lock in here and focus down and only talk about stuff that explicitly has to do with the monument. We are done with all these distractions. But then again, while I was looking through all that spiritualist stuff, I did find some really cool information about Joseph's house. This is good stuff, and I kind of think it'd be a shame to not mention it in the video. So even though this doesn't really have anything to do with the monument, let's just take one more real quick detour because I think this is worth it. So feast your eyes on Hazard Castle, aka the Wizard Castle, as it was known to locals of Narragansett, Rhode Island. Hazard built most of this place back in the 1840s. The only exception being this huge 105-foot tower that's set back a bit from the rest of the castle. Joseph had that built in the 1880s, and again, the South Kingstown Library is a big help here. These pictures that I got of the tower's construction are all from their collection. They even got one really cool picture of how the view from the top of the tower used to look back in 1884. Unsurprisingly, the erection of the tower was again probably related to spiritualism. Embedded in the walls of the tower are a couple of tablets dedicating the structure to the Hazard family, along with a few other families who had close ties with the Hazards. And although I never found any direct quotes from Hazard himself, the theory at the time was that the tower was meant to be a sort of living space for all of the deceased spirits of the Hazards and their friends. Unfortunately, I can't show you any video of how the castle looks today because it's been converted into a private boarding school, but that's actually okay, because the real interesting part of the castle is not even the building itself. It's the grounds that used to surround the building. See, back in the 1800s, Hazard's castle used to be encircled by a massive jungle of rare trees and bushes that Hazard imported from all across the world. Apparently, he made a point to never trim or cultivate any of the plants. He just wanted them all to grow and develop naturally. So over time, his land grew into this massive labyrinth-like tangle of greenery. The most weird wilderness of eerie woods that can be imagined, according to one newspaper article. Just this great mass of plant life so thick it was practically impenetrable. Supposedly, Hazard used to stand in his doorway and then throw potatoes into the yard, and wherever the potatoes landed is where he would go out and plant a new tree. And he'd also walk around his property with a handful of seeds and his cane, and he'd poke holes in the dirt and drop the seeds in. So clearly, Joseph really loved his little hodgepodge international forest. And also, he was very protective over it too. There were no guns allowed on his land, and nobody was allowed to kill anything on the property, not even an insect. And most importantly, there was absolutely no damaging the plants. Do not even think about touching the trees. Apparently, one time in the 1860s, a guy actually died at Hazard's house, and then the guy's family cut down a tree branch so they could drive a carriage up to the front door to pick up the body. And Hazard got so mad at that that he banned the family from ever staying at his castle again. Unfortunately though, just like with the castle, I can't show you this forest. This time though, it's because the entire thing was destroyed during the Great New England Hurricane of 1938. What a shame. Now, I know I said that I was just going to talk about Hazard's castle and then get back to the murder monument, But I feel like I should probably at least mention that Hazard actually had a second house in addition to the castle. This one was called Druid's Dream, and there's actually a pretty interesting story here as well. Hazard meant for this house to be a kind of memorial to the Narragansett Native American tribe that lived in Rhode Island. He even went so far as to exclusively hire members of the tribe to construct the building. The only problem, though, is that beyond the fact that Hazard wanted to honor the Narragansetts, he really had no idea what else to do with this new house he just built. And so, after Druid's Dream was completed in 1884, it sat completely empty and unused for the rest of Hazard's life. For literally years, it was unoccupied until Hazard finally died in 1892. Like with the castle, Druid's Dream is a private residence today, so unfortunately, I can't show you any video of it beyond this shot of the hedges in front of the house. Although, while we're here, there actually is something else that I could show you. Something that just so happens to be right across the street from Druid's Dream. Welcome to Joseph Peace Hazard's Druid Circle. A collection of 8 stone pillars with a pile of rocks and concrete in the middle, built by Joseph Hazard back in 1883. Now, at first, you might think that this was some kind of mystical altar where Joseph Hazard would perform strange ceremonies and occult rituals, but no. What you're actually looking at here is a grave site, or at least was a grave site before the headstone in the middle of the pillars was removed from the Druid Circle. Originally, this was where Joseph Peace Hazard wanted to be buried. It's pretty shocking to see how much the forest has grown up around the circle, right? You even used to be able to see the Hazard Tower way in the distance there. Even though Hazard's monument is gone nowadays, from looking at the pictures, we can see that it really wasn't anything too fancy. It just had Joseph's name and family history on it, along with a nice little poem about feeding the birds. Whatever their mode of faith or creed, who feed the wandering birds will themselves be fed. What a nice sentiment. And check this out. If you look closely at the 8 stone pillars around the circle, you'll notice that half of them have flat tops and the other half have bowls cut into them. Well, the reason for this was so water would fill up the pillars and give the birds a nice bath. How sweet is that? Hilariously, Joseph also only named this place the Druid Circle long after he had built it. In his own words, apparently he was just looking at it one day and thought, hey, you know what? That looks a whole lot like something that a druid might build. And then he just started calling it the Druid Circle. And he also decided to name his new fancy house Druid's Dream while he was at it. Unfortunately, I really couldn't find any info on why Joseph wasn't actually buried here after he died. For whatever reason, he was instead laid to rest in a small cemetery in Portsmouth, Rhode Island, that now is on private property. But even without Joseph's grave, this is still a really cool place to visit. And not just for the Druid Circle, because right nearby are a couple more of Joseph Hazard's famous monuments. And let me tell you, these two are especially bizarre. They don't really have anything to do with the location that they're sitting in, and as far as I can tell, they're kinda just commemorative stones for people that Joseph Hazard admired. Like this one here is for some guy from London named Edmund Head that once took care of one of Hazard's near and dear relatives over 100 years ago. Hazard does not say who that relative was or why he's putting this stone here of all places, but there it is. And this one on the other side is for a married couple named John and Isabella Wakefield, who died decades before this stone was erected and also are not buried here. John was a banker and Hazard's sister was named after Isabella, and that is about the only information that the stone can offer. Oh yeah, and also, right next to these two pillars is this weird rock that Hazard put on the property that everyone calls the witch's chair because it kind of looks like a recliner. I found absolutely zero information on why Hazard wanted this here. By the way, if we can return to those pillars for a minute, have you noticed by now that Hazard seems to have a particular style with all these monuments? Like, they're always made of granite and they always have that same big blocky lettering on them. It's a pretty recognizable look, right? So, I'm kind of thinking, with how prolific of a monument setter Joseph Peace Hazard was, there has got to be some stones of his around southern Rhode Island that we haven't talked about yet, right? Like all the ones that we visited in this video, I only knew about because I found some newspaper article or a history book that was talking about them. Maybe if we look in the right spot, we can actually find a Hazard monument all on our own, out in the wild, so to speak. Like, take a look at this. Pretty close to Druid's Dream and the Druid Circle is this road called Hazard Avenue. And then on the other side of these trees is another road called Kendall Court. And if you look at a trail map of this area, you can see that there's actually a hiking trail that kinda looks like it lines up with Kendall Court. If you ask me, I think there's a good chance that this whole thing here used to be Hazard Avenue. So how about we pop over to that nature preserve and take a look around. And would you look at that? One side of this monument says Gibson Avenue, which is the name of this street here, and the other says Hazard Avenue, which is the old street that's been converted into a hiking path today. Obviously, I have no proof that this is a Hazard monument, but it sure looks like one to me. It's granite, it's got that same blocky lettering, and it's right near Hazard's house. What a cool find. But as cool as that is, I feel like it's finally time for me to face the facts. Unfortunately, I've pretty much exhausted my research capabilities, and still I do not have any answers on that murder monument in the bushes. I still don't know why Joseph Hazard felt the need to put up the stone, and I still don't know how he landed on all those specific details. Unfortunately, I think that I just need to admit defeat and accept that this video is going to be a failure. But then again, why am I so focused on the murder monument in the first place? Like, why do I keep trying to center the video around just that one stone? Like, is the monument really any more interesting than Joseph Hazard's watch journal or the Druid Circle or his rare tree forest? Like, yeah, I heard about the murder monument first, and I definitely started the research process with that in mind as the keystone of the video. But why can't I just open my mind a little and find a new way to structure the project as I learn new information? Because there's really no need to get caught up on just one feature of this really incredible man's life. Especially because we have not yet talked about the craziest part yet. Yeah, I got one last little tidbit for you. And this one is actually a kind of personal connection of mine to Joseph Peace Hazard. See, a few years ago, I made a video called A Wreck is a Wreck that to this day is still probably my personal favorite video that I've ever made. The video is mostly about Block Island, a little piece of land that sits a few miles out from the New England coast. Block Island has this old folktale about a ghost ship called the Palatine. According to the legend, the Palatine was a ship from 1752 that ran aground on the rocks surrounding Block Island. And, if you believe the folklore, as soon as the ship got stuck, the Block Island residents rushed out to it, killed all of the passengers, robbed the ship, and then lit the Palatine on fire so nobody would ever find out what they did. What they didn't account for, though, was the ghost of the Palatine hanging around to haunt Block Island. Every so often, a fiery apparition of a phantom ship appears off the coast of the island, just to make sure that the Block Islanders never forget their crimes. Pretty good story, right? Well, not according to the Block Islanders, especially back in the day. They hated this legend because obviously it makes them all seem like thieves and murderers, right? Of course they're gonna hate it. Like, don't even think about bringing up the Palatine story in the presence of a Block Islander. But as much as these people hated the Palatine story, they especially hated a certain man for spreading the story around. John G. Whittier, a famous poet in his day who once wrote an extensive poem about the Palatine ship. In the poem, Whittier plainly accuses the Block Islanders of tearing the ship apart and lighting it on fire and letting everyone die, and apparently this poem caused such an explosion of people buying into this story that it went from this like small little localized legend to a black mark on Block Island's history that was known all across the country. Like, believe me when I tell you that the Block Islanders hated Whittier for spreading this story around so extensively. They hated him so much, in fact, that years later, Whittier actually felt like he owed the Islanders a bit of an apology, or at least a justification for why he slandered the good name of Block Island. Now, everything that I just told you is a summary of what I talk about in my video from a few years ago. So I think now I'm just gonna go ahead and play the part of the video where I talk about Whittier's apology. Listen to this. And hey, here's something especially crazy. I actually even found a written response that Whittier wrote to address the complaints that he was making up stories. In regard to the poem Palatine, I can only say that I did not intend to misrepresent the facts of history. I wrote it after receiving a letter from Mr. Hazard of Block Island, from which I certainly inferred that the ship was pillaged by the Islanders. So basically he's just like, oh, don't look at me. I didn't come up with the story. I just heard about it from somewhere else. Don't shoot the messenger. Now, as I'm sure you can guess, the Mr. Hazard in that quote was our good friend, Joseph Peace Hazard. Almost 3 years ago, I was already talking about this guy completely unknowingly. Like, literally the entire time that I was researching this video, I was getting this like weird familiar feeling. Like, I knew that the Hazard name was like ringing a bell somehow, but I just couldn't place it. And I actually did not even put the pieces together myself until I found this article from 1880 where Joseph Hazard tells a local newspaper that he just saw the Palatine light personally off the coast of Block Island. And hilariously, the newspaper adds that prior to this, nobody had claimed to have seen the light for almost 50 years. So not only did Joseph Hazard tell this story to John Whittier and unintentionally help spread it around the country, he also pretty much single-handedly resurrected the legend from obscurity. So if there's anyone that the Block Islanders should hate, it should be Joseph Peace Hazard. But hey, before we go, I actually want to share one last thing with you. And I don't know why, but this last little detail just really gets me for some reason. So after I learned about the whole Block Island Joseph Hazard connection, I went back to check my notes for the Block Island video, and just look at this note that I wrote to myself almost 3 years ago. I said, Whittier apparently heard the Palatine story from some hazard guy. Some hazard guy indeed. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.